Hello, American Prestige viewers. Welcome to another video exclusive episode of American Prestige. I am joined by, obviously, I'm Derek. I'm joined, very happy to welcome back to the podcast, Alexander McKeever. He's been on before. He's the publisher of This Week in Northern Syria. Last time we had him on, I think, was back in February to talk about the situation following the battles between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Syrian government in the northeastern part of the country, and how the things were unfolding in the wake of those monumental events. Alex, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Yeah, of course. Glad to be here.
So we wanted to talk about you. You've done a bit more. Last time we had you on, you had toured the Northeast. You've gone through the Northeast and spoken to people and kind of assessed the situation. This time around, you've taken a few more trips into the northwestern part of the country, to Afrin, along the M4 highway. So we want to talk about how things are unfolding in that part of Syria. Maybe first of all, just kind of orient people to the places that you visited and that you've written about. We'll have links, obviously, to all this stuff in the show description. But to kind of give people some orientation, uh, talk about Afrin and sort of the northern Aleppo area. Some parts of this were really intimately involved in the fighting that took place earlier this year. That were where it broke out, really, in like the Sheikh Maksud area of Aleppo, for example. But Afrin is sort of that history goes back a little bit of ways. I mean, the Turks and their allied rebels removed, let's say, excised the SDF from that area quite some time back. So maybe talk a little bit about the history here and what distinguishes this region from the Northeast, where you were traveling previously.
Yeah, so I guess just to answer the first part, when we first spoke, I had been in Raqqa, in sort of which is on the Euphrates in the center of the country, that had just been, I think, 2 weeks prior, been captured by the government, or the SDF withdrew. Since then, I've visited Afrin a couple times. I was there during Nowruz, the Kurdish national holiday. That's around the spring equinox in March. And then I was there in May. I was staying in Aleppo City, which is by minibus, like an hour drive. So I did a couple day trips to Afrin. Unfortunately, it was just in the city that time. In March, I traveled around a little bit around the countryside. And then most recently, about a month ago, I traveled out to Qamishli, which is still under SDF control. And so far, I've published a sort of a little dispatch about the bus ride driving east along the M4 highway, which is a pretty vital transit hub. That was also, parts of it were kind of the front line in various parts of the war between the SDF and Turkey and the Turkish proxies. So Afrin is a Kurdish majority area that's the northwestern corner of Aleppo and sort of the northwestern corner of Syria overall. It's a district of Aleppo that's almost entirely Kurdish populated. Has actually some small religious minorities. The estimates are quite vague, but before the war, it was estimated that there was about 15,000 Yazidis. So this is a sort of heterodox, syncretic faith that the practitioners are all Kurdish speakers, but in Iraq, the politics of identity gets a little confusing. From what I understand, in Syria, they all consider themselves both Kurds and Yazidis. There's actually, interestingly, a small Alevi population. So this is distinctive from what in Arabic the words are the same, but Alawis, so like the sect of Bashar al-Assad. Um, but this is a continuation of Kurdish-speaking Alevi populations that exist in Kurdistan, northern Kurdistan, Anatolia, etc. So the only such community in Syria, which is interesting and pretty. I had no idea this was true until I stumbled across it. But anyway, over the first 7 years of the war, Afrin was solidly under the control of the YPG, YPJ, the PYD party. This project, it represented one of the three cantons that were basically the Kurdish majority areas along the border that the what became the SDF took over early on, and it was somewhat isolated. I mean, it was definitely isolated from these areas, and it was under a soft siege. I mean, it had relations with both the opposition groups and the regime that at various times controlled portions along its borders. And people would go back and forth, like to Aleppo city, which is obviously a very significant economic hub for all sorts of, and also for all sorts of administrative paperwork. People would need to go there. So people did travel back and forth, but these areas were relatively isolated and unto themselves. This changed in 2018 when Turkey launched a large scale military offensive, which included both the Turkish military, Air Force, ground troops, as well as the Syrian National Army, which was the collection of opposition groups, which Turkey kind of collected together and created this unified structure that was really under Turkish control, but sort of visually Syrian and made up of what had been FSA groups and some Islamist groups, but quite ununified uh, in reality. So this was a 2 month military operation. Afrin is uh, relatively mountainous. I mean, none of the Kurdish areas in Syria are the mountains that people picture when they think of Iraqi Kurdistan or Turkish Kurdistan. Um, but it's for northern Syria, it's quite hilly and these kind of obscure terrain. And actually, it's famous for the olive harvest. There's millions of olive trees, and when you're there, the olive trees kind of stretch out over the hills. It's a very beautiful place, especially in the spring. So this, in the wake of this military offensive, which was successfully carried out over 2 months, the SDF withdrew at the very end. They were kind of allowed to leave, and the numbers are like numbers throughout the Syrian war, hard to really quantify. But at least 100,000 local residents of what the had been a 300,000 of half a million population of Kurds prior fled, likely more, but some did return in the years ensuing. But so you have this large exodus of displaced peoples from the area. And since then, or between 2018 and the fall of the Assad regime in 2024, these areas experienced a large array of abuses against the local population and against cultural heritage, and also there's a significant amount of deforestation in these areas. So it's a quite the image of Afrin is quite painful to Kurds since 2018. And also, there was large IDP populations coming from elsewhere in Syria that ended up in Afrin, and this created fears that there would be permanent demographic change, etc. So then, with the fall of the Assad regime, in but also I should say that Afrin was joined to other parts of northern Aleppo, and then eventually to parts of northeast Syria that had come under Turkish control and were administered, in actuality, by interestingly the different Turkish provinces along the border. But nominally, there was a Syrian administration, and so this represented an area that was separate from the areas in Idlib that were under HTS control. So with the fall of the regime, oh,
Before we talk
sorry.
about this, I want to ask, like, how, and I don't know how apparent it is. We can talk about this when we get more into what you saw while you were there. But you talked about the administration here coming from the neighboring Turkish provinces. How well, I don't want to say integrated, but how far did that go? Like, to what extent was Afrin and this part of northern Aleppo, um, sort of incorporated, if you will, not in a real sense, but in the practical sense, into sort of a Turkish way of doing things or Turkish administrative system?
So the fear from the Kurdish side, there was a lot of allegations about this, is that these were being set up to be annexed. I don't think that this was the case. They were definitely incorporated into various. How do I put this? So basically, the Turkish lira, even today, is the predominant currency in these areas. The Turkish postal system had operated branches in each of these areas, which is actually how the salaries of administrative workers and actually the SNA factions were being paid because they were receiving salaries from Turkey. Actually, a lot of this was funded by Qatar, but Turkey was the real hands on the ground. Um, and you have the Turkish various Turkish ministries were involved. The Turkish Ministry of Interior was actually handling the real security within these areas through its gendarma and the police special forces. So I wouldn't say that these were incorporated into Turkey because Syrians living in these areas couldn't freely cross the border, and whenever Syrians, for the most part, Syrians that were crossing the border into from Turkey into Syria, refugees, these were being deported. So there was
Right.
definitely and there's a border wall that stretches the entire way. So this was sort of an ad hoc uh, occupied area that was Turkey was investing in significantly. So they were trying to ensure the stability of these areas, partially to prevent further refugees from entering into Turkey, because this has
Right. I
become
mean, this always seemed like the best argument against the idea that they were setting this place up to be annexed, was that there was so much concern on the part of the Turks about another refugee situation. It just didn't make sense that they would absorb these this area that had a lot of refugees, in addition to population, the sort of residents, the regular local residents of that region, into Turkey. If it's more that they were trying to administer and impose some stability here to avoid that outcome, to avoid having another flood of refugees.
for sure. Turkish policy made a pivot in 2015, 2016. This can be traced back to a number of developments, including the Russian intervention in Syria, the coup attempt, the breakdown of the PKK peace process. Early in the war, Turkey had pursued regime change and was the most active. I mean, along with Qatar and Saudi, but really in the north was the most active in terms of supporting the opposition and allowing the movement of even weapons, but also like jihadi foreign fighters entering via Turkey to go on to fight against the regime. But after these key events in 2015, 2016, Turkish policy really became dictated by two main concerns, which was stopping the further influx of refugees. I mean, it's interesting because actually, like the AKP government and Erdogan were quite in favor of the refugee influx, and you talk to Syrian analysts, and actually, the Islamists view these as people that can potentially become citizens, or some of the Islamists that will be supporting the Islamists and against maybe secular Turks. But you had a large backlash between both sort of the center left and the center right, and then the far right. Various different sectors of Turkish society became very hostile to refugees. And so, creating stability in these areas that were outside the regime's control in Syria and preventing a further influx, this was a significant impetus for Turkish policy post 2015. And then also, you had the breakout again of active war with the PKK, the SDF's core being directly from the PKK, though strategically not involved in operations against Turkey at all, very much separated from that. So this is what dictated Turkish policy from 2016 to 2018. The Afrin invasion was part of this to both uh, walk back advances by the SDF and also create more areas where IDPs coming from other parts of Syria could settle, where refugees deported from Turkey could be placed to ensure this stable region.
So yeah, so go back to, I cut you off. You were going to talk about what had happened in this area after the fall of the Assad government. So let's pick that back up.
So one of the first developments was that a lot of the IDPs that were residing in Afrin were from southern and central Syria, from either the Damascus suburbs, from Homs, from Hama, from these areas that had been pockets of opposition control that the regime had slowly captured over the years. So a lot of people left pretty soon after the regime fell. I mean, they were some were living in tents, some were living in these cinder block villages that had been created by Turkey and sponsored by mostly either Gulf or Islamic charities from around the world. So you had this departing of a portion of the IDP population, not all of them, that were from these areas, and then you had the slow integration of the local administration and the factions that were present into the Damascus-based HTS-led government. So, I mean, we talk about SDF integration today, but really all the various actors that were not HTS have been integrated into the current government because the SNA and various opposition groups really lacked any sort of political platform. This integration was smoother, though arguably, especially in the military file, is still relatively piecemeal. So over time, Turkey started handing over various portfolios within Afrin, within the areas adjacent to it as well, Azaz to the Euphrates. This is the stretch of northern Aleppo. And Turkey began withdrawing its Ministry of Interior Security Forces and various other civilian bodies from these areas, though the Turkish military actually remains. But the Turkish military was, I mean, really, if you look at the geography where the bases were, this is along the former front lines and some sort of for strategic depth. But the real the real Turkish security forces that were interacted with on a day to day basis in the city and that maintained control over the local Syrian security forces were all from the Ministry of Interior. And these, over maybe 6 months after the fall of the Assad regime, slowly were withdrawn and left the area. And the Syrian government has taken over these capabilities within the region. So,
So, oh,
yeah,
sorry, no, sorry. Go ahead, go
no,
ahead.
I mean, there's so much to talk about. I'm just kind of
Yeah, I
flipping
mean, I was
through
going to
what's
get into
next.
your dispatches, but if there's more background that is relevant,
You've
go for it.
you In this time you also did have sort of the organic return of IDPs from Afrin Kurds uh, returning on a individual basis. I've seen figures about 20,000. It might be significantly higher. I'm not, again, numbers are all relative and hard. There's no real data on these, or at least not publicly. And you had the appointment of a district official. So basically, the under the province, districts are the main block of administration. And currently, you have one official for each district that sort of runs all the affairs, and then there's directorates underneath and sub districts. So you had the appointment of actually, he was actually a Kurd, but he was of an HTS background. I mean, there are Islamist Kurds, and he wasn't a local though. He was from Hasake originally, from the northeast. So he was the face of the local administration, and you had the internal security forces take over, and you had factions, the SNA factions that were, a lot of them were, I mean, none of them were from Afrin. Some of them are from Aleppo or neighboring parts of Idlib, but some were from much further away in Syria, and so some of these had left. All their members had left because they could go back to their homes then. But, yeah.
So let's talk about what you saw, and I wanted to start with your walk through the Sheikh Maksud and Ashrafia neighborhoods in Aleppo. This is where the first really fighting that took place in that uh, campaign. I don't really know what you want to call it. Use any term you want, I guess, between the SDF and the Syrian government began in these neighborhoods. How much of an indication of that fighting did you see when you were walking through? Like, is it lingering? Is there still, does it still seem like a place that relatively recently saw some fairly heavy fighting? What's going on there?
So I basically just did a 2 hour walk. I was staying in the center of Aleppo. Uh, these areas are not that far away from the center. They sort of make up the northwestern corner, but it's the edge of them is about a 45-minute walk from the very center of the city, so quite close. I mean, this little trip I did, I was basically just meeting up with a friend who was from nearby areas who used to have family in Sheikh Maksud and Ashrafia. Um, Basically, just meeting up and catching up with him, and then like doing a little walking tour. It's quite brief, and it wasn't, I wasn't like doing interviews or anything, so I don't want to attach too much importance to this. But in term physically, the edge of the what had been this enclave, there was significant damage, but this wasn't necessarily from the January battles. I mean, part of it definitely was, but this had been an SDF enclave, or originally YPG enclave, dating back to the early years of the war. There'd been some early little skirmishes against the regime. There'd been some skirmishes against the opposition. But so when you walk under these buildings, there's a mosque. It's sort of Sheikh Maksud's on this hilltop. So there's this mosque that, if you've seen pictures of the area, you've definitely seen. Um, and it's been half destroyed, I think, for years. And there's apartment buildings behind it. So, yeah, you could tell that there've been battles here, but hard to really say what was new, what was old. And you could still see sandbags in some of the windows. I mean, these had been military positions, a lot of them. The mosque and the apartment buildings behind them, immediately behind it, not all of them. But these had been SDF, or later on internal Asaish. It's a little confusing. Frontline positions. But pretty soon after, actually, you got to the residential buildings that were still being lived in, and some actually had recently, seemingly, had reconstruction or some sort of renovations, like apartment by apartment. And then, I mean, again, it's a big area. I took one route, so I can't say that I saw too much of it. But walking into the center of it, pretty soon after, you stopped seeing any indication of fighting until you got to this former school that had been turned into a hospital several years before, which is kind of where there had been this last standoff. It's a little hazy what exactly happened. The government says that the combatants who were defending the area had sort of holed up in there as a last position. The Autonomous Administration SDF were accusing the government of attacking the hospital with there not being any combatants there. But I mean, when you're there, there was definitely a battle around. There's bullet holes. Some buildings have been collapsed around there. The hospital, former school, had clearly suffered some damage. There was minor reconstruction work going on. There's sort of piles of tiles and stuff, construction materials. Um, but yeah, overall, didn't see too much, to be honest, which is a little surprising. I mean, this trip, so I was talking with my friend who is a Kurd from Afrin, but grew up in a neighboring area. And this northwestern corner of Aleppo is interesting. It's basically where Kurds and other people from the countryside began moving in the 1950s due to the economic magnetism of Aleppo. And these areas became sort of the hub for this internal migration. And these neighborhoods are kind of in an order, and Sheikh Maksud is the poorest and has the worst services. And sort of, as my friend was saying, that your family moves there first, and then you sort of save up some money and try to move further down. Ashrafia, parts of it are relatively nice, and the other neighboring areas even nicer. Um, so basically, most of what I was sort of learning was about just the lack of services in these areas. In Arabic, these kind of areas are called ashwa'i, which means random, which is basically unzoned areas. Don't have many schools, don't have hospitals. Again, this is why this hospital I mentioned was actually a school that had been converted into a hospital. and various other services are quite lacking. And houses are sort of built without permits, just cinder block, kind of built floor at a time. And what I was hearing is that the fear is that this area is just going to return to what it was. So not, we're not talking about like severe repression of the populations. It's more just that they're going to linger in neglect and not have political representation, not have good services, etc.
And that, I mean, that really feels like one of the things that you encountered in Afrin from reading your piece, that there's almost like the war's over, which should, you would think, end the isolation of this area, and yet the isolation brought with it Turkish involvement in administration, humanitarian aid for the people who were displaced in this region. It had a lot of effects in terms of concentrating attention for money and governance in this area that's now gone, right? I mean, so how much of a concern is it in Afrin, or what did you see in Afrin in terms of the living conditions for people now, and concerns that maybe that they're being forgotten, which seem to come through in your writing?
So I guess at first I'd like to say that there are definitely many Kurdish specific concerns, but a lot of the issues facing Kurds in Syria are actually much broader. Um, the issues of neglected areas is quite big in Syria. I mean, you had very centralized investment in cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, in the centers of them. And then, I mean, through regime connections, you had certain areas. I mean, get into the Alawi side of things, but there was not that like Alawi areas necessarily had significant investment. I mean, and there's a lot of very poor Alawi areas as well, but there were certain like suburbs that were mainly like regime connected Alawis that got significant investment, whereas other areas didn't. So I'd say that this neglect is quite common in peripheral suburbs and rural areas throughout Syria. So I don't think that the story in that regard is necessarily one specific to Kurdish areas. But of course, there was significant repression against Kurdish identity and political representation overall. So in Afrin, what I was really hearing in May was, I mean, again, I'm doing day trips. I'm not necessarily doing field research. I mean, my newsletter is based on open sources, so I don't want to speak with too much authority here. Um, but essentially, that services over the last under the Turkish occupation were actually pretty good compared to what there was before, and this was due to Turkish investment in the areas. Again, coming from the stabilization that I'd mentioned in a bid to sort of prevent deteriorating conditions and potential refugee outflows again. Um, and then also, because these areas were concentrated along the border and were pretty small, the international NGOs that were active in opposition controlled areas in Syria were highly concentrated in Afrin, in Idlib, in Idlib actually less so because people were afraid about the terror designation of HTS. But you had maybe non-Western NGOs and some UN work. There was various workarounds. Um, but so for years, I mean, of course, there was widespread poverty. I mean, this is Syria during the civil war. But in Afrin, for example, and I think other areas, I haven't been to like Azaz yet or Al Bab, these other cities in northern Aleppo. There was like repaving of streets, and electricity was being directed from the Turkish grid actually into these areas, being sold through this Turkish Syrian company that everyone kind of hated because they were raising rates constantly and there was no transparency. But you did have services and investment in a way you didn't have before. And so since the regime fell, basically you have this NGO attention that was highly concentrated in these areas has now been spread across the country offices have all been centralized into Damascus. Areas that, for good reason, like Deir ez-Zor, where it's the city that suffered the worst destruction in Syria, that gets attention. Other areas, there's basically not that much in terms of international aid entering Syria, and it's not going to the areas that it used to. So that's what I was hearing. Also, locally, so Afrin was governed by a local council that was really overseen by the Hatay province in Turkey, but they did have some revenue that was being generated by a border crossing between Afrin and Turkey that actually has since been shut down because it wasn't a border crossing before the war, and the government's shut down the ones that have popped up since and returned to just the 2011 ones, except one special case in the Northeast, but we can maybe talk about that later. So that revenue, even if that border crossing was still open, that revenue would be going straight to Damascus and then being doled out nationally instead of going to the local council and then being used for local projects. So that source of revenue is gone. I mean, across Syria, the economic situation is not good, and unemployment levels are high. So these are, again, issues that Afrin faces that are faced across the country in many areas outside the centers of major cities and wealthy suburbs. To get into sort of the more Kurdish specific questions in Afrin, I mean, we have one of the main issues that occurred under the Turkish occupation was the seizing of property by the SNA militias, which today, when people talk about them in Afrin, they just call them the factions, the Fasa'id. So these factions, which were basically, initially they had been sort of Islamist or FSA groups, but pretty quickly devolved into basically just groups around individual warlords, had seized significant amounts of commercial, agricultural, residential property. A lot of this coming from people that had fled the area, but not just that. And since then have maintained control of these or taken rents from the owners, taxed like agricultural products in Afrin. A lot of it's the olive oil, and or stolen fields, and then we're exporting oil to Turkey that was getting relabeled as Turkish or even, I think, even Spanish olive oil. There's like some weird stuff going on there. So and then also renting these out to displaced peoples from other parts of Syria. So now that through the SDF government integration process, there's been a concerted effort to return Afrini IDPs that were residing in other SDF areas to Afrin. And this has been a pretty successful endeavor. I think currently between 8,000 to 9,000 families, which, you multiply that number by 3 to 5, have returned. And a lot of them have been able to receive their property back, though not all of them. So this is a problem that's specific to Afrin. There's still, I've heard about 19,000 displaced peoples, mostly from eastern Syria, from areas that were under SDF control or still under SDF control, that are residing in Afrin and so far have refused to leave. I think a lot of them come from Deir ez-Zor and might come from parts of Deir ez-Zor city where neighborhoods are just completely destroyed. So there are reasons that aren't necessarily they just want to keep other people's property related to this. But there's been numerous issues, both related to real estate and then social issues around this. So some people that come back to Afrin, former IDPs, are unable to currently receive their property because it's still being controlled by former members of the factions or others that were related to them that have seized the property or are demanding fees to return the property. And then sometimes when people from other parts of Syria leave these houses that were stolen and rented out to them or whatever, they'll loot everything in them, like stealing even the doors. So actually, a portion of the people that have returned to Afrin are currently residing in the villages that were constructed by Turkey to house IDPs from other parts of Syria because they can't access their property. And so that's an Afrin Kurdish specific issue. Then I think maybe we could talk about this more broadly at some point. There's the issues related to Kurdish political representation, to Kurdish cultural rights, to linguistic rights, etc.
Yeah, let's save that for later, or maybe we could, we could move into your trip along the M4 and into Kamishli, and what you saw there that sort of distinguishes that part of the country from what you saw in Afrin, and the commonalities, in terms of the what's going on there.
Yeah, so about a month ago, I took a bus from Damascus to Qamishli, which is usually, I've been told, like a 9 to 10 hour ride. But recently, there had actually been flooding on the Euphrates, because luckily this year there's been so much rain in the winter and in the spring. Northern Syria and other parts of Syria were really beautiful from March to even a month ago, like very green in a way that I think many people don't realize that Syria is. Um, but Turkey had released water without giving an adequate warning to the government in Syria, despite them being, very friendly. Just and this caused a mini disaster in which the dams in Syria that for years had been the reservoirs have been dwindling were now at capacity, and they had to immediately release water. So several thousand acres of agricultural land was flooded in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, and a number of people were displaced, several thousand, and there were some incidents of drowning that were related to people swimming in flood conditions. But anyway, the bus was diverted from the usual route from Damascus through Deir ez-Zor to Qamishli to the northeast to a 12-hour ride that was a bit brutal. But the buses actually in Syria are quite nice. There's good AC and comfortable seats. But so we drove up to Aleppo and then took the M4 highway, which goes all the way to the Iraqi border, passed along what had been the Turkish controlled areas in northern Aleppo, through Minbij, and then along what had been the front line further east between the areas that Turkey had taken in 2019. So, I mean, I wrote a dispatch that was basically just observations on the bus ride. Given that I'd done a lot of work with geolocation, I was quite familiar with many of these localities. And so it was interesting for me to kind of pass through what had been various front lines and for the first time see things. And this is true now that I've been living in Syria. Currently, I'm in New York, but living in Syria, I'm able to go to all these areas that obviously you couldn't go to before, or were quite difficult. But so on the M4, I guess the main thing to say is that there's still a number of Turkish military bases that kind of dot the highway. You still see Turkish flags over what are clearly military installations. Some of them seem to have been abandoned or people have been redeployed elsewhere, but the Turkish military is still present. I saw Turkish military vehicles on the road around Al Bab, also in Afrin. On the way to Afrin, I saw some. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was like, to be honest, it was kind of something I was just writing more for myself. I mean, I think for people that are really in the weeds, like I am on some of these issues, maybe it was interesting. And then I guess the most interesting thing is eventually I crossed into the areas that are still under SDF control that are slowly going through the integration process. And I passed through the joint checkpoint, which features both members of the government security forces. Interestingly, it was the customs enforcement, not the internal security. So this is a police force that's actually affiliated with the Border and Customs Agency, not the Ministry of Interior, and who are actually quite active in the east. I'm trying to get some details on it. I've heard stuff about. I mean, basically, it's the government. A lot of the revenue is coming from customs. So out east, these areas that are being integrated, and there's some trade from Iraq, especially right now. There's a lot of oil convoys of oil tankers. They're very present. But I found it interesting that they were the ones that were on what had been the front lines, checking trucks that were coming back and forth. And then on the other side, it's the Asayish, the internal security forces of the SDF. But then, yeah, the checkpoint actually, like, they didn't even check the bus. There'd been a checkpoint earlier where I'd gotten actually taken off because they were like, "What's this person with an American passport doing out in the middle of nowhere on the Raqqa Hasake border?" But after like one or two questions, I
Must be
was
up to no
immediately.
good. I mean, come on. That's very
But
funny.
I was immediately let back on the bus after one or two questions. So, but yeah, crossing the line was very mundane. And then you pass actually two abandoned American military bases, one of which is now where one of these integrated SDF Syrian military units, or that's in the process of being integrated, is being garrisoned. And then you're in Kamishli. And, um, you are, if you don't look at the flags and the patches, it very much feels like other parts of Syria. I mean, having been to Afrin and Kurdish parts of Aleppo city, and actually there's a Kurdish sort of slum I've been to in Damascus. Hearing Kurdish on the street isn't that unusual, and the buildings and everything is. I guess the interesting thing about Qamishli was that it was actually built during the French Mandate, and the street layout was designed by a French military officer. So it's a grid that's actually quite walkable, and a lot of the streets are now pedestrian only, either in front of churches or some of the commercial streets, which is quite a sort of pleasant novelty compared to other parts of Syria. Um, but yeah, I mean, basically the main things I was talking to people about there is the integration process that's been going on since January, like what's going on. And then what people want to speak to you about really is the economic situation. So I guess going into the integration process first, since there's this agreement signed on January 29th that was vaguely laying out how the SDF as a military body, excuse me, and the civilian administration was to integrate into the Syrian military, into the Syrian state. And basically, these areas would enter the rest of government-controlled Syria. This agreement, I think it was about 15 points, but I still believe we haven't seen the actual text. There was a leaked, or someone had published supposedly what was the text, but we don't exactly know. But overall, things were vague and in many regards, and were sort of laid out to be negotiated later. And there has been progress in a number of different files. Right now, there are 4 brigades that are being established that are being staffed by members of the SDF, of not the female units, the male units, that are being integrated into a division of the Syrian military, one of its 20 or so military divisions. One of the 5 assistant ministers of defense, these are geographically defined assistant ministers. So the minister for the East is Sipian Hamo, who is a veteran PKK, Syrian national, but joined the PKK back in the late 80s or 90s, has this pretty great mustache that's, of course, all good PKK cadres have. And a very interesting guy, actually. But he is now the assistant minister to the Minister of Defense, who is a former Jabhat Nusra, Al Qaeda cadre. And there's been funny pictures of him with some of the. There's this Turkmen backed, or this ethnic Turkmen, Turkish backed guy who is like one of the SDF's main opponents over the last 10 years. And now they're both assistant ministers. So it's very bizarre seeing photos of them together. They're actually the only two that only have mustaches, because of course so many of them are from Islamist backgrounds. They either have a beard and mustache or just the beard. So this is a kind of funny thing to track. But so there's militarily, there's been some of these the new brigade commanders have undergone training under the Damascus Ministry of Defense. I believe, I'm not clear whether it's just unit commanders or the entire brigade of the Qamishli unit have been sent to Damascus or to the Damascus countryside to enter a military academy and have since returned to Qamishli. Other units, I think the Qamishli one is the one where there's been most progress. There's a Kobani one, a Hasake one, and then Derik, which is another city in the northeast. These are, I think, earlier on in the process. That's occurred. There's been a governor for Hasake that's been appointed from the SDF side and approved by Damascus, that's now in office. Um, there's, I guess, two of the most important aspects in terms of civilian life is that the certificates that were offered by the schools affiliated with the autonomous administration, that this was a unaccredited, unrecognized internationally curriculum. The Ministry of Education recently said that they are going to accept all these diplomas. So this is really big, actually, because for the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that elected to enroll in the autonomous administration schools over the last 15 years, now these are being recognized as Syrian diplomas. Side note, this is for the preparatory and secondary schools, not for the universities. Potentially, the Ministry of Higher Education will accept those degrees as well. But this has been sort of a reoccurring issue in the Northeast for the last 15 years, this unaccredited school system. So that's big. The stateless population of Kurds, X number of Kurds back in the 60s were stripped of citizenship through this overnight census that claimed that they had crossed the border. I mean, some of them were refugees fleeing Turkey due to insurgency in the 20s, Kurdish, Turkish conflicts. But this was a lingering issue, especially because under Syrian law dating back to the 50s or 40s, maybe, only Syrian men can pass on citizenship. So because a lot of Syrian men, Kurdish men in the 60s were stripped of citizenship, their descendants, it's been a sort of exponentially growing issue over the years. But due to the decree that President Ahmed Bashar had issued back in January, there's a process ongoing to award citizenship to these populations that are still stateless. So in these regards, integration has been real and ongoing. But going there, you are still very much outside government-controlled areas. Things are still occurring as they were prior. And really, when you talk to people about how integration's going, they say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
who knows? I think one of the issues is that this is a process sort of speaks to both how decision making is made in Damascus and then also to some degree on the SDF side, is that this is a very elite and opaque process in which the designated group, the group assigned by Ahmed Ashara to handle this portfolio, and then the people around the SDF commander Mazlum Abdi are the ones that are negotiating this, and the populations at large on both sides don't have any input, and many times have no idea what's being discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also been hangups specifically related to the Ministry of Justice file, where the government is trying to take over the courthouses in Hasake and in Qamishli, and they've agreed to integrate judges from the autonomous administration judicial system, which, like everything, has its own judicial system that's partially based on the thought of Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK commander. There's been disputes about how to integrate the staff. Basically, Damascus wants to be sent like a list of people, and they'll go through them individually, and they will select some of them, and then also appoint their own people. A lot of them actually are people from the days of the old regime that are just kind of Ministry of Justice staff that I guess the government's determined are innocent enough that they're okay having them in the bureaucracy, or just bureaucratic staff, sort of mundane. So they're actually wanting to appoint a lot of these people from the old regime. And meanwhile, the SDF side is saying, no, we want X amount of our people appointed sort of as a block within. So it's basically a question of seats this is true sort of throughout all the administrative negotiations about how many people from the autonomous administration will be accepted into the new government and in what capacity. And because the court system has not been integrated, and there was also sort of tensions about what languages are going to be on the sign. I don't know if you saw videos, but signs kept getting put up by the government and torn down by sort of PKK aligned activists because they didn't have Kurdish on them. This has been frozen for about a month. And recently, actually, I heard from the SDF side that, yeah, there has been no progress and no talks actually about the specific file. And this is one of the main ones that is preventing sort of further integration on the ground. Yeah.
So I guess as a final question, do you envision, I mean, that's a good sort of overview of where integration stands in general. Do you envision any regional challenges between a place like Afrin where the YPG, the PYD was removed by the Turks, but is trying to include, or has tried, I think, to include in the integration process, which would suggest that it's trying to get maybe get back into that area politically, versus places that were under YPG control, under the SDF control, right up until the end, that are transitioning now to incorporate the Syrian government. Do you think there's going to be a bifurcated thing here happening? Like, what are some of the are there any sort of unique challenges in how the process will go in those areas?
I mean, it already is quite different just given the history of Afrin since 2018. The how the government's approached integration, the fact that there are, I mean, now with people returning, actually, there's even been reported occasional arrests of uh, people from the PYD SDF side that have returned to Afrin. It's a little unclear. I mean, these are sort of reported in Kurdish media, like a couple at a time when convoys of returnees have arrived. But I think this speaks at large to the issues of political life in Syria currently. Um, Given right now across Syria, there is no party law that regulates how political parties are to function. Um, there are parties that are functioning, but but not with any sort of legal recognition. And this affects obviously Kurdish parties, but sort of political life at large. And just 2 days ago, the final list of people to be appointed into the legislative body, which was 2/3 of it were sort of elected by a very small electorate that was selected by the government. 1/3 has been handpicked by Ahmed Ashara. And this was just announced. So the People's Assembly is going to meet soon. And one of the first things that they're supposed to do is pass this legislation that will sort of regulate party life. Right now, the situation is, I'd say, just quite unclear. We don't know to what extent uh, parties will, to how free political life will be. I mean, right now, the situation in Syria overall with everything is sort of semi-free and unclear. No one really knows where red lines are, and the government has been responsive to political public pressure about certain issues. So everything's sort of being negotiated in very unclear ways. But so for Kurdish political life, yeah, it remains to be seen. I mean, ideally, the PYD would function as a normal party. I mean, personally, my belief is that armed struggle at this point is a dead end. Really, the best thing is for things to be integrated, and then for the Kurdish movement to, I mean, there's multiple Kurdish movements, but for the PKK Kurdish movement to reorient itself as a political party, and for the political landscape to be one where this is possible. I think that that's the best case scenario. But recently, actually, so there's been issues with the People's Assembly, the legislative body. The PYD decided to boycott the elections, that the limited elections that had occurred. So basically, all the opposing political parties, on the opposing Kurdish parties, and it gets very complicated, they were the ones that have sent people now to the legislative body. There's no one from the PYD in the legislative body. So basically, you now are having PYD people being integrated into the local administrations and the military, in the military and over nationally, and then the local administrations in the east and in Kobani, a part of eastern Aleppo. So they're very present there, but they have no representation in the legislative body. And then the opposite is true for the Kurdish parties that oppose the PYD, which are under the banner of the Kurdish National Council. So it's confusing. Yes, right now in Afrin, two of the three members that they're sending to the legislative body are affiliated with the opposing Kurdish coalition. So it seems like Afrin will sort of remain under their control, whereas in Hasake, the administration will be under sort of under PYD control. Everything's quite up in the air.
Up in the air is probably a good place to leave it. Everything is up in the air. But Alex, thank you so much for doing this, and we would be I'd be glad to have you back. As you continue observing what's going on in Syria, just to kind of keep on track, keep in touch with what's happening. So, really do thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be back on soon.